in the bustling city of Lagos, there lived a wealthy businessman named Mr. Adewale. He owned many companies and was known for his riches. But there was one thing he desired more than anything else: to become the richest man in all of Africa. Mr. Adewale was not satisfied with just having money. He wanted power, and he believed he could get it by marrying a mermaid. One day, Mr. Adewale called his most trusted worker, a man named Colonel. "Colonel," he said, "I have heard stories about a beautiful mermaid who lives in the waters near the village of Adewale. They say she is magical, and anyone who marries her will become the richest person in the world. I want you to go to that village, find the mermaid, and bring her to me." Colonel was shocked. "But sir," he said, "mermaids are dangerous creatures. They are not meant to be captured or married. What if something bad happens?" Mr. Adewale laughed. "Nonsense. I don't believe in those old tales. Just do as I say, and you will be rewarded handsomely." Colonel had no choice but to obey. He gathered a group of men and set off for the village of Adewale. The village was far from the city, surrounded by thick forests and deep rivers. It was a place where people still believed in the old ways, where the spirits of the land and water were respected. When Colonel and his men arrived at the village, they asked the villagers about the mermaid. The villagers were afraid and warned them, "The mermaid is a powerful spirit. She is not to be disturbed. Many have tried to capture her, but none have returned." But Colonel did not listen. He led his men to the river, where the mermaid was said to live. They set up camp by the water, waiting for her to appear. Night after night, they kept watch, but the mermaid did not show herself. One night, as the moon shone brightly over the water, they heard a soft, haunting song. It was the voice of the mermaid. Colonel and his men were mesmerized by the sound. They followed the voice to the edge of the river, where they saw her beautiful and mysterious, with long, flowing hair and scales that shimmered like gold. Colonel thought about Mr. Adewale's promise of riches and power. Without thinking, he threw a net over the mermaid, trapping her. The mermaid struggled, but the net was too strong. "We have her," Colonel shouted to his men. But just as they began to celebrate, the sky darkened, and the wind began to howl. The river started to churn, and the ground shook beneath their feet. The mermaid's eyes glowed with anger as she spoke. "You have made a terrible mistake," she said. "I am not just any mermaid. I am the guardian of these waters, and you will pay for your greed." Before Colonel could respond, the river erupted into a giant wave, sweeping him and his men into the water. The mermaid disappeared beneath the surface, and everything went silent. Back in Lagos, Mr. Adewale waited for Colonel to return, but days turned into weeks, and there was no sign of him or the mermaid. Mr. Adewale began to worry. He had no idea that his greed had angered the spirits of the land and water. One evening, as Mr. Adewale sat in his grand mansion, a strange mist filled the room. Out of the mist appeared the mermaid, her eyes filled with sadness and fury. "You have sought riches through greed and cruelty," the mermaid said. "Now, you will learn the true cost of your desires." Mr. Adewale tried to speak, but no words came out. The mermaid raised her hand, and suddenly, the room began to spin. Mr. Adewale felt a cold chill run down his spine as everything around him started to blur. The walls of his mansion seemed to melt away, and before he knew it, he was no longer in his grand home. He found himself standing on the banks of a river, the same river where Colonel and his men had gone to capture the mermaid. The sky was dark, and the air was filled with an airy silence. Mr. Adewale looked around, confused and scared. He tried to move, but his feet were stuck to the ground, as if the earth itself was holding him in place. The mermaid appeared before him again, her face full of sorrow. "You have been brought here to witness the consequences of your actions," she said softly. "Your greed has not only endangered my life, but also the lives of those who served you." Mr. Adewale trembled as he realized that he could not escape. "Please," he begged. "I didn't know. I only wanted to become the richest man in Africa. I didn't mean any harm." The mermaid's eyes softened for a moment, but then they hardened again. "It is too late for apologies. You must face the punishment for your greed." With a wave of her hand, the waters of the river began to bubble and swirl. Out of the depths emerged Kunal and his men, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. They were alive, but they were trapped in the water, unable to escape the powerful current that pulled them under. "You see," the mermaid said, "those who seek to harm others for their own gain will never find peace. Kunal and his men will be bound to this river until they understand the pain they have caused." Mr. Adewale watched in horror as Kunal and his men struggled against the water, their voices calling out for help. He wanted to help them, but he was powerless. The mermaid turned to him again. "And as for you, Mr. Adewale," she continued, "your wealth will be your curse. From this day forward, every coin you touch will bring you nothing but sorrow. Your riches will vanish, and you will be left with nothing but the memory of what you have lost." Before Mr. Adewale could protest, the ground beneath him began to crumble, and he felt himself falling. He tumbled into the dark, cold waters of the river, sinking deeper and deeper until everything went black. When he awoke, he was back in his mansion, but something was different. The grand furniture, the expensive paintings, and the glittering chandeliers, all of it was gone. The mansion was empty, cold, and dark. Mr. Adewale rushed to his safe, where he kept his money and jewels, but when he opened it, there was nothing inside. Panic set in as he realized the mermaid's curse had come true. His wealth was gone, and with it, his power. He was alone in the empty mansion, with nothing but his regrets. Desperate, Mr. Adewale tried to reach out to his business partners and friends, but they all turned their backs on him. News spread quickly about his downfall, and soon, he was left with nothing but the memory of the mermaid's warning. As the days passed, Mr. Adewale wandered the streets of Lagos, a shadow of the man he once was. The once proud businessman was now a beggar, searching for food and shelter. But no matter where he went, the memory of the mermaid's curse haunted him, a constant reminder of the price of his greed. One day, as Mr. Adewale sat by the roadside, an old woman approached him. She looked at him with kind eyes and said, "There is still a chance for redemption, if you are willing to change." Mr. Adewale looked up at her, hope flickering in his heart. "What must I do?" he asked. The old woman smiled gently. "You must return to the village of Adewale and make amends for the harm you have caused. Only by helping those you have wronged can you hope to lift the curse." With no other options left, Mr. Adewale decided to follow the old woman's advice. He began the long journey back to the village, not knowing what awaited him there or if he would ever find peace. Mr. Adewale's journey to the village of Adewale was long and difficult. Without his wealth, he had to walk for days, relying on the kindness of strangers for food and shelter. The once proud businessman was humbled by his circumstances, but he was determined to make things right. When he finally arrived at the village, the people of Adewale recognized him immediately. Word of his downfall had spread far and wide, and the villagers whispered among themselves, wondering why he had come back. Mr. Adewale approached the village elders, his head bowed in shame. "I have come to ask for your forgiveness," he said quietly. "I know that my greed has caused great harm, and I want to make amends." The eldest of the villagers, a wise man named Bob Bartend, stepped forward. "We warned you, Mr. Adewale," he said sternly. "The spirits of the land and water are not to be trifled with. You have angered the guardian of the river, and now you must face the consequences." Mr. Adewale nodded, his heart heavy. "I understand, but please, tell me what I can do to make things right. I am willing to do whatever it takes." Bob Bartend looked at him thoughtfully. "There is only one way to lift the curse," he said. "You must offer a sincere apology to the mermaid, and perform an act of kindness that proves you have changed. Only then will the spirits consider forgiving you." Mr. Adewale listened carefully. "How can I find the mermaid again?" he asked. Bob Bartend led Mr. Adewale to the edge of the river, where the mermaid had been captured. The water was calm, but there was an air of sadness around it. "The mermaid appears only to those who are truly repentant," Bob Bartend said. "You must sit by the river and reflect on your actions. If your heart is sincere, she will come to you." Mr. Adewale did as he was told. He sat by the river, his mind filled with regret and sorrow. He thought about all the people he had hurt, especially Kenel and his men, who were still trapped in the water. Tears filled his eyes as he realized the depth of his greed and the pain it had caused. For hours, he sat by the river, lost in thought. As the sun began to set, he felt a gentle breeze on his face, and the water began to ripple. Slowly, the mermaid emerged from the depths, her expression calm but watchful. Mr. Adewale stood up, his heart pounding. "I am truly sorry for what I have done," he said, his voice trembling. "I was blinded by greed, and did not realize the consequences of my actions. Please, forgive me." The mermaid studied him for a moment, her eyes searching his soul. "Words alone are not enough," she said softly. "What will you do to show that you have changed?" Mr. Adewale hesitated, then said, "I will use whatever I have left to help those in need. I will dedicate my life to serving others and making up for the harm I have caused." The mermaid nodded slowly. "Very well," she said. "There is one more thing you must do. The village of Adewale has suffered because of your actions. You must help rebuild what has been lost and ensure that the people here have what they need to thrive." Mr. Adewale agreed, feeling a sense of purpose for the first time in a long while. The mermaid looked at him with a hint of sadness. "You must also release Kenel and his men from their watery prison," she said. "They followed your orders, but they did not deserve to suffer for your greed." Mr. Adewale bowed his head. "I will do it," he promised. With a wave of her hand, the mermaid caused the river to part, revealing Kenel and his men, who were still struggling against the current. Mr. Adewale reached out to them, pulling them to safety one by one. As he did, he felt a strange warmth in his chest, as if a heavy burden was being lifted from his soul. Kenel and the others gasped for breath, their eyes filled with gratitude and relief. "Thank you," Kenel said weakly, "for saving us." Mr. Adewale shook his head. "No," he said. "Thank you for helping me see the error of my ways." The mermaid watched them silently, then spoke once more. "You have taken the first step towards redemption, Mr. Adewale," she said. "But remember, true change comes from the heart. Continue to live with humility and kindness, and you will find peace." With that, she disappeared back into the river, leaving Mr. Adewale and the others standing on the bank. The air was still, and the village was quiet, but there was a sense of hope in the air. Mr. Adewale turned to Bob Barton and the villagers. "I will keep my promise," he said. "I will help rebuild this village and ensure that everyone has what they need. I will use whatever resources I have left to make things right." The villagers, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, nodded in approval. They knew it would take time, but they were willing to give Mr. Adewale a chance to prove himself. As the days turned into weeks, Mr. Adewale worked tirelessly alongside the villagers, helping to rebuild homes, schools, and farms. He used his remaining wealth to bring in supplies and experts to teach new skills to the people of Adewale. Slowly, the village began to thrive again, and the curse that had plagued Mr. Adewale's life started to lift. For the first time in his life, Mr. Adewale felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not from wealth or power, but from the joy of giving back to others. The mermaid's words echoed in his mind, reminding him that true riches came not from money, but from the kindness and generosity of the heart. As the village of Adewale flourished, so did Mr. Adewale. He was no longer the man driven by greed, but someone who had learned the value of compassion and humility. Though his journey was far from over, he knew that he was on the right path, and somewhere in the depths of the river, the mermaid watched over him, knowing that her lesson had been learned. As time passed, the village of Adewale blossomed into a place of joy and prosperity. The once small and struggling village had transformed into a vibrant community, thanks to Mr. Adewale's efforts. The villagers no longer feared the river, for they knew that the guardian mermaid watched over them, her presence a silent protector. Mr. Adewale, now a humble man, had become a beloved figure in the village. He spent his days working alongside the villagers, teaching them the skills he had learned as a businessman, but with a heart that was now full of kindness and generosity. The children would often run up to him, eager to hear his stories about the city, while the elders would seek his advice on matters of trade and commerce. One day, as Mr. Adewale was helping to repair the village school, a young girl approached him. Her name was Adewale, and she was known in the village for her bright smile and curious nature. "Bob Adewale," she said, tugging at his sleeve, "is it true that you once met the river goddess?" Mr. Adewale smiled warmly at the girl. "Yes, Adewale, it is true," he replied. "She taught me a very important lesson about life and how we must treat others with respect and kindness." Adewale's eyes sparkled with wonder. "Do you think she will ever come back to the village?" Mr. Adewale thought for a moment before answering. "The river goddess is always with us, Adewale, even if we cannot see her. She lives in the water, in the trees, and in the hearts of those who choose to do good. As long as we remember her lessons, she will always be near." Adewale nodded thoughtfully, then ran off to join her friends, leaving Mr. Adewale with a sense of peace. He knew that the mermaid's influence would remain in the village for generations to come. That evening, as the sun set over the village, Mr. Adewale decided to take a walk by the river. The water glistened under the golden light, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds returning to their nests. He found a quiet spot by the river bank and sat down, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. Suddenly, the water began to ripple, and out of the depths, the mermaid emerged once more. Her appearance was as enchanting as ever, but there was a warmth in her eyes that Mr. Adewale had not seen before. "You have done well, Mr. Adewale," the mermaid said softly. "You have kept your promise and restored balance to the village. The spirits of the land and water are at peace." Mr. Adewale bowed his head in gratitude. "Thank you," he said humbly. "It is only because of your guidance that I was able to change. I am forever in your debt." The mermaid smiled gently. "There is no debt, only the joy of seeing someone find their true path. You have proven that even the darkest heart can be brought into the light with the right choices. Mr. Adewale looked up at the mermaid, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. I will continue to do good, he promised, not for reward, but because it is the right thing to do. The mermaid nodded in approval. That is all I could ever ask. You have learned the most valuable lesson of all, that true wealth is not measured by gold or silver, but by the love and respect we show to others. As the mermaid prepared to return to the depths of the river, she paused and looked at Mr. Adewale once more. There is one more thing, she said. The spirits have decided to lift the final part of the curse. Your wealth, what remains of it, will be restored to you. But remember, it is not the money that defines you, but how you choose to use it. With a graceful dive, the mermaid disappeared beneath the water, leaving behind a gentle ripple that spread across the surface of the river. Mr. Adewale watched as the water settled, his heart filled with gratitude and resolve. When he returned to the village, he found a small chest waiting for him at the entrance of his modest home. Inside were the last remnants of his wealth, enough to continue helping the village, but not so much that it would lead him back to the path of greed. Mr. Adewale smiled as he closed the chest, knowing that this time, he would use his riches wisely. He would invest in the future of Adewale, ensuring that the village would continue to thrive long after he was gone. And so, Mr. Adewale became a true guardian of the village, just as the mermaid was the guardian of the river. Together, they ensured that the balance of nature and humanity was maintained, and that the lessons of kindness and humility would be passed down through the generations. As the years went by, the story of Mr. Adewale and the mermaid became a cherished legend in Adewale, a tale of redemption and the power of change. And in the depths of the river, the mermaid watched over the village, knowing that her work was done, but her spirit would always remain. Years passed, and the village of Adewale grew into a prosperous town, known far and wide for its harmony with nature and its thriving community. Mr. Adewale, once driven by greed, had become a wise and respected elder, beloved by all who knew him. His story, along with that of the mermaid, was told to children as a lesson in the importance of humility, kindness, and the true meaning of wealth.